Shuffle is a 2005 anime adaptation of a visual novel by the same name. The anime did decently well in Japan, garnering enough attention to later receive a recap series, and in the West received a good quality dub, however has since faded into obscurity, becoming the sort of show that long-time anime fans might suggest to you that is unlikely to come up in general discussion. This lack of staying power, combined with a somewhat mixed reception in the West, has left the show in a somewhat unknown position. Few reviews of any real merit in video or essay format exist, and most of the ones that do spend large amounts of time being somewhat ironically butthurt that their favourite waifu didn't win. Or my favourite review on Mal, which somehow has the most likes for the series, explaining how the show is bad because Rin is indecisive, and in doing so completely missing the entire point of the show. But I digress. Taking all this into consideration, I think it's high time someone, amateur or otherwise, wrote a half-competent review and analysis of the property. Unfortunately, I'm the only person available. It's a property which I personally think is one of the best in its genre, nay, the Evangelion of the harem high school visual novel genre. Try saying that 3 times in a row. Shuffle as an anime, which is all we'll be addressing here, is packed with layers of visual storytelling, animation abuse, and fantasy metaphors for real-life illnesses. Its topics as it's first and foremost a cleverly written and entertaining harem rom-com, but secondly is a fascinating deconstruction of the genre it belongs to. It isn't afraid to call out its audience on topics as delicate as lolitas, yanderes, and even the time-honoured best girl debate. It's received unsurprising levels of flack for these bold moves, from people who hate its intentionally flawed main characters, to others who think a yandere with a serious codependency mental illness deserves to win the day. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those who write the whole show off as soap opera crap, with forced drama and conflict. For this essay, I'd like to stand in Shuffle's corner and fight its side of the debate, hopefully without getting tangled up in the semantics of preferable 2D fictional girls and the merits of wish-fulfillment characters too much. Writing this actually proved to be somewhat difficult as to how to divide up the various strands of the show and the ridiculous layers of depth that can be daunting. As such, I'll divide this into segments or arcs and cover characters as we go along in further depth. To anyone still reading this who hasn't seen Shuffle yet, now's your time to bail, as heavy spoilers are ahead, but take my word on it, and go watch Shuffle with an open mind. Give it the benefit of the doubt, and you might just be pleasantly surprised. I'm aware my usual reviews have a more detailed spoiler-free segment, but on this occasion all that needs to be said is that it gets my highest of recommendations. If you're unconvinced after watching it, feel free to come back here and read the rest of this retrospective, and if you're still unconvinced after that, shoot me a message and let me know why. Without further ado, let's get to the main topic. Arc 1. The Fairy Tale Arc, episodes 1 through 11. You can divide Shuffle's 24-episode run into multiple different ways, either by character or plot, but for the sake of this essay we'll call episodes 1 through 11 the Fairy Tale Arc, 12 through 16 the Awakening Arc, and 17 to 21 Honest Feelings. Finally, episodes 22 to 24 is the Redemption Arc, or the smallest part. These titles are by no means official, but should make it easier to categorise the various episodes as we go along. So keeping on topic, the Fairy Tale Arc is a somewhat self-explanatory name. In the interest of this not becoming one of those monotonous recap reviews, I'll try to keep story breakdowns short where possible. The first arc rapidly introduces us to the world of our characters, the world of our story and its characters. Based in a small Japanese city, it becomes quickly apparent most of the settings parallels our own real world, but that after an unknown event, the walls between Earth and what is essentially heaven and hell have weakened, allowing for travel and commerce between the 3 worlds. As such, we find ourselves in a typical educational setting, except where humans, gods and demons, plus hybrid combinations therein, all attend the generic high school anime. This, in true harem fashion, is all conveyed in quick succession within the first episode, and clearly left vague for the sake of mimicking other shows in the genre, retaining a sense of mystery. While the world of Shuffle is generally pretty fleshed out, it is seldom the focus. Instead, that is always on the characters. In fact, even the intro song goes to great lengths to reinforce this fact, with its opening on a close-up of each girl, followed by shots of the town deserted with no vocals in the background, to effectively communicate at the start of every episode that this is a story all about people, not places, but more on the title song later. Moving from this, we're introduced to our lead players. Over the course of the first 2 episodes, Asa Shigure, Narane, Litiantus, or Sia, Primula, Kaide Fuyo, and Rin Tsuchimi. There is also a number of decently fleshed out side characters, but again, if you've not seen the series and you've read down this far, I'd once more advise you finish the show and then come back, as this is about as much exposition as I'm going to be giving out. All that table dressing out of the way, let's get down to it. As mentioned, the Fairy Tale Arc generally requires the least to understand. This isn't to suggest it's any less layered than the rest, but instead that this arc is intentionally written to give the show a solid foundation and set up each of its cast members. The brilliantly natural drama of the show's second core can only function as well as it does due to the legwork put in by this first arc. The arc also does a marvellous job of foreshadowing for future events, which can make rewatches of said episodes feel like an Easter egg hunt, as you try to spot all the telltale signs the show lays out to hint at its true directions and intent. I won't spend too much time on the episodes of the first arc, as I'm sure I'll reference them in more detail during the specific character breakdowns. However, I will draw a few scenes to your attention now, as I feel it helps better with understanding character themes we'll be referencing a lot later. Episode 4, Egg Omelette of Happiness. Within this episode we get a microcosm of what's to come. During it we see Narane attempt to learn to cook an omelette for Reen to show him her affections. Straight away we start to see an interesting transgression in the show's portrayal of archetypes. If you're unaware, Shuffle's characters do actually qualify for the general stereotypes of anime rom-coms. This is more obvious for some than others. For example, Primila's physical appearance makes her the clear Lolita type. Meanwhile, Narane seems to be the obvious dere at the start of the series, with Asa as the tsundere, Kaide the yandere, and Sia as the tomboy, although that's sometimes been called bakadere more recently. However, Narane straight away shows one of the core beliefs of the show. The characters are people first before their tropes. In Narane's case, we see this in her inability to bake and her somewhat pampered upbringing. Generally, the dere type is highly devoted, often for shaky reasoning. A great cook, a competent homemaker, of a quiet disposition, and usually will be the least aggressive of the girls in the harem. But like we said, the whole episode's premise revolves around Narane not being able to cook, and we see on multiple occasions that she's hopeless at housework. None of this is to say Narane isn't a dere, but to simply reinforce the fact that the show, in each of its character premises, is already going against standard anime conventions. Now, with those traits in mind, let's go back to episode 4, where we see Narane in the cooking club room attempting to cook. She cuts herself with a kitchen knife, only for Asa to enter the room. She immediately produces a plaster from her pocket and helps out Narane with her cut finger. After some quick consoling, Narane asks for tutoring. In the following 10 seconds, the show manages to tell us everything we need to know about both characters in a matter of frames. Asa shows herself to be an experienced chef at home in the kitchen, and even more important are her motherly tendencies. Despite only being vaguely acquaintances at this stage in the story, Asa immediately goes to help, and furthermore carries plasters, clearly for similar accidents with other underclassmates, and we know she at least taught Kaide, rather than plasters for herself. Meanwhile, Narane is shown to be reserved and shy, unwilling initially to ask for help, almost prideful. She's somewhat naive in her thinking, and clearly a little clumsy. This goes further thanks to their clothing. As we'll talk about more as we go on, clothing is often used to show development, or as a literary shorthand throughout the story. Here it's quickly used to establish the duo's relationship with the kitchen, and to reflect parts of their personalities. Narane's apron is a girly pink and frilly. I'd go as far as saying it's ill-fitting. It reminds us of her status as a princess and her baking ineptitude. Meanwhile, Asa wears a plain, green, well-fitted apron with no frills in sight. Aside from being colour-coded to her hair, it represents her level-headed, no-nonsense attitude and practical, motherly nature. This is wonderful visual characterisation. The first arc is full of subtle moments like these that help to further develop and make for sufficient short-form character growth. We could talk about these at length, but the point in hand is to illustrate how the show, with quiet visual cues and minimal dialogue, conveys its character traits and habits in a natural way, which seems a far cry from more modern anime's blunter approach. Putting this short scene aside, the episode also has another scene that greatly helps to illuminate another important staple of Shuffle, its double-ended foreshadowing. This comes at the end of the episode, where Narane reconfirms her devotion to Rin, and is seemingly the obvious conclusion of the episode, except as becomes apparent later on. The scene takes on a whole new meaning after it's echoed in episode 15. When Narane says, "Is it okay if I fall in love with you?" she's essentially realising for the first time her own feelings, as up until now, she's simply been pursuing Rin out of a survivor's guilt complex towards her twin clone sister Licorice. Well, we can't know this on the first time around. This line acts as an early clue that the Narane we know isn't all she seems. This is further compounded by the fact that Sia constantly references her childhood memories of Rin. Meanwhile, narratively, Narane comparatively rarely does this, and while this initially seems due to her disproportionate screen time, on a rewatch this line makes far more, almost tragic sense. This first arc is littered with foreshadowing like that to come. Another example of both the above topics from episode 4 presents itself in episode 9. Survival at the beach. Here we see what will soon become standard fare for Rin. While believing himself and Sia to be stranded offshore and under attack by a wild animal, Rin offers in an altruistic fashion to stay behind and buy Sia time to run away. On the surface, this seems like the right thing to do, and you'd be forgiven for initially thinking as such. However, the prevailing theme of Rin's arc is that doing what seems socially right, rather than what's actually best for a person in question, isn't always for the best. We'll see this in far more important ways during the Awakening and Honest Feelings arcs, but Rin's short-sighted thinking is a reoccurring cause of hurt for the whole cast. Using the example as outlined above, what would Sia do if she did run? Ankle injured and seemingly marooned on some desert island. Without Rin, her chances of survival seem slim, but then, emotionally speaking, she would surely be distraught. And the real important thing is actually neither of those two factors. Rin's self-sacrifice idea is bad because it's not what Sia wants. She wants to be with him, whether that's deserted on an island or to die to some terrible wild beast. All she wants from him is companionship, which, in the moment, Rin can't see. That's far from all that could be said about episode 9. The fact alone that Rin and Sia temporarily find themselves in an Adam and Eve situation, while a heavenly choir sings in the background, is probably worth a more detailed discussion. But for our purposes, this is the first example of Rin's misplaced altruism and is an important feature of the episode. Aside from that, there isn't too much to draw particular attention to in the show's opening act that we won't bring up later in more depth when we look at each character. I'd be remiss not to mention, at least, that the first 8 episodes wonderfully display... I'd be remiss not to at least mention the first 8 episodes' wonderful display of a short arc for each character. Episode 11's well-placed comedic break for background characters as well. And, of course, anime's best long-running joke, the KKK, not the guys in the sheets, the Knights of Kisikaide, who are rather appropriately phrased out more and more in the second act as the show's tone begins to darken. One final note on the first act, for the time being, would be to mention the show's use of the traditional Japanese family unit. As the whole arc revolves around setting up an idyllic world where you, the stand-in protagonist, is surrounded by attractive girls and magic as well as fun, wacky adventures, we also have a family unit to add to that fantasy, Kyu Kaide and Primula, who become a comfortable stand-in for Rin's adoring housewife and well-mannered daughter. The show paints the trio expertly in an almost make-believe young family, while always making sure to use enough Dutch camera angles and cutaway shots to remind us how unrealistic this found family is. This comes to a head in the aptly named Episode 6, Smile. The episode is Primula's spotlight moment, like Episode 4 was for Narane. It revolves around exploring this newfound family dynamic and starts to hint at Primula's true nature. Primula is an interesting one, and we'll discuss her far more when addressing Arc 2 and even Arc 3, but it should suffice to say her deadpan archetype is a mirror for Ruri Hoshino, who, in turn, pays homage to Rei Ayanami, who is, well, you get the picture. Like in those shows, and long before the likes of Heaven's Lost Property would repopularize it, the episode revolves around Primula's lack of emotions and inability to smile. I must say it's one of the show's strengths that they get past this part of her character so quickly, and don't feel the need to linger on the smiling thing for too long. And while it's most probably a coincidence, this being episode 6 is the same episode in which Evangelion's Rei first smiles, but once more I digress. This episode also heavily features Kaide, and Rin, but that's the case for all the episodes except 11, which is logical considering her surrogate mother status. Kaide in these early episodes more accurately fits the childhood friend or dere archetypes better than any other, though we will see fairly frequent foreshadowing of her impending breakdown, especially in some of the rather chilling scenes during episode 5 and 10. All in all, though, we'll address her more in her own arc, as her role is mostly secondary in episode 6. As I mentioned, this episode deals with Primula. First off, showing us some brilliantly simple choreography, where during school hours we see that Primula essentially wanders Rin-Kaide's home as though she were little more than a ghost. Quick cuts start with a skewed top-down view of Primula walking towards the camera, looking minuscule in the house's large porch area. They move to a short montage of shots showing her moving along hallways in the kitchen. The lack of music in the stationary camera lends these scenes an eerie feeling as it becomes increasingly clear what the show's trying to say. When Rin and Kaide aren't home, there's no funny comedy skit or secret hobby that Primula takes part in. She just exists, like a doll or a lingering spirit. She simply just stops being relevant without the presence of others. The show further hammers this home when we see Primula aimlessly channel hopping on the TV, her reflection prevailing through the images of flamboyant Japanese daytime programming. The shows are hollow, devoid of soul, man-made for a shallow purpose, simply thoughtless entertainment. And then she turns off the TV. And the shot lingers for an uncomfortably long length on her face's reflection on the screen. If you still haven't picked up the metaphor, the show has one more image in its toolbox, as it shows Primula playing with her cat doll, its head held up in front of her so that the sunlight shines through the window on it. It's illuminated while she's covered in the shadows of the dimly lit room. The light on the doll is representative of how Primula to her it means love. Her only keepsake of leakeries, or anyone for that matter. While meanwhile her being in the dark reminds us, at least on rewatches, that she's unnatural, inhuman, and unloved. She stares at the doll like an imaginary friend, or not as like an imaginary friend, but as though she expects it to prove her existence, all tying into her character's theme of neglect. Following this, we get a somewhat controversial set of scenes, including a partially nude Pramila and a laundry shopping scene. There's actually a lot that can be talked about here, and in terms of the morality and appropriateness of the scene, we'll talk in greater detail on that when we address the show's theme of maturity and nudity. Catchy little title. But to give some surface level thoughts and clarifications on it, Pramila is not a lolly, at least not in the modern or traditional senses of the word. By the end of the show, she has become one, but especially in the show's early stages, she clearly is meant to be a child first and foremost, and as such, Rin repeatedly expresses a lack of interest in her romantically. Even after episode 15, this doesn't seem to change much at all. The lingerie shopping scene is really quite mundane, and by anime standards, markedly tame. Additionally, the idea of people dressing kids up as mini-me's is by no means exclusive to Japan, and if anything, is used to show how much of an outsider Pramila is to the group, and how uninterested or non-understanding she is by the whole affair. All told, it works with some cheap laughs as well as playing an appropriate story function, so I can't really see how you can draw much issue with it unless you've never watched any other anime with a token Lolita before. Again, I don't want to get bogged down on it, but as far as braless Pramila in the Rain, I think it's really important to acknowledge how the scene is highly important to the narrative. From a few seconds of a flash and Rin's reaction, not embarrassment for seeing her breasts, but shame for not considering his standard daughter's needs, we better learn a lot about both characters. We learn Pramila has an almost childlike understanding of relationships, gender, sexuality, and even common sense clothing etiquette. As stated, for Rin, it reinforces how Pramila isn't an object of similar sexual desire. It shows his integrity or maturity, and it shows us just how out of his depth Rin really is when it comes to trying to raise a child at such a young age. Could this have been communicated differently? Of course. Simply have Kaide or ask Pramila to try on one of her old t-shirts while Rin is sitting watching TV. Pramila could comply immediately, switching off her current top in a nonchalant manner, revealing her undisclosed chest, which to the audience would be obscured by a chair or Rin's now flustered face, and a funny scene could ensue with Kaide and Rin lambasting each other, or Pramila for not addressing this earlier. Would that or something similar carry the same weight and that quiet sense of nuance? Probably not. And that's something that becomes reoccurring in Shuffle. Raw storytelling through nudity, natural drama, or heartfelt, honest dialogue is how the show operates. As I first mentioned, we'll go into more detail on this later, but the show never gives us call to think these scenes are done with lustful intent, and I think Shuffle more than deserves the benefit of the doubt. The episode concludes with Rin gifting Pramila a replacement stuffed cat doll. Aside from some fun jokes mixed in, like Kaide fainting twice, or the nyandam, the resolution scene is sweet and rather straightforward. Rin gives Pramila the cat, which for Pramila symbolises love, and not some twisted meaning of the word, but instead it in its most base form, the sort one feels towards a sibling or parent. This familial love is ironically one of the only emotions Pramila seems to have a true grasp on, and thanks to Leaker, he's demonstrating it to her with the first cat plushie. This is enough to further her and Rin's bond and close the episode out on a smile. In Rin's own words to Itsuki, your ability to turn something innocent into something obscene amazes me. Episode 6 alludes to and overall helps explore the dynamic of Shuffle's fanciful family unit, something Clanad would later more famously go on to do in more detail a few years later, albeit in a different style. Episode 12 would be the start of the end for this make-believe scenario. It should be noted that if Shuffle was just an 11-episode harem, it would still be above average, but overall, generally serviceable show. But with the changes alluded to in Ep 10 and hammered home in 12, we move into the second arc and the real heart of the story. With all our preamble and setup over the first arc done now, we can really get to what makes this show so great. Hi, that's the end of this part of the video. If you enjoyed please leave a like and feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments below. These won't come out in particularly quick succession, as this is predicated on a topic that's already pretty friggin' niche. However, if you want to go read ahead, the entire thing is on my Mal account, link in the description below as we speak, and so you can read it all there in one big go. Thanks for watching.